Yeah.
Essa bateria, então.
Boa tarde a todos. Obrigada pela presença de vocês. Vou fazer uma introduçãozinha só em português, já passo para o inglês, tá? Ela vai falar em inglês, mas se vocês tiverem alguma dúvida, é só levantar a mão ou interromper ou perguntar que a gente esclarece, tá? So welcome everybody. It's very good to have Professor Shiun here with us. She's from the Tampa University in the United States. She will tell us about the trajectory of personal background, right? So I'll let her introduce herself in more detail. Thank you, Shiun, for coming from us and coming to visit us and share your knowledge with us. She's going to talk about navigating geopolitical risk, managing corporate social political engagement in the development market. Please feel comfortable if you have any doubts or you want to ask some questions. I think Shiun is not going to be bothered if you ask her anything during the presentation. She already has been with our group and it worked very, very well with this kind of dialogue, right? So Shiun, page is yours.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for the introduction. And so, like Professor just mentioned here, I'm from University of Tampa. Okay, so that is in the central part of Florida. And I put a picture up there. That's the picture of my campus. So we are known for those historical buildings looking like a castle along the river. Okay, and I will welcome all of you if you get a chance to visit me. And I'll be super happy to see you again over there. Okay, so this is gonna be the outline of my presentation today. So I'm gonna give you a brief introduction of my background, so you know where I'm coming from and why I'm interested in the research I'm presenting to you today. Okay, and then we're gonna go to the topic, look at geopolitical risk. We're gonna go over some definition. And then I'm gonna introduce you a framework I use all the time in my research to look at the institutional environmental differences between your home market and the host market, right? So the topic today is going to be about emerging market firms, acquisition in the developed market, and then how do they overcome the liability of foreigners through two types of non-market strategies. One is the so-called corporate social responsibility, which usually what we talk about the CSR strategy, right? So that should be the well-known topics that you have been learning here. And another one, I believe, is last discussed, and which is getting more and more important nowadays, given today's global political environment. And so this is the second type of a non-market strategy I'm going to present to you today. So we call it the corporate political activities. So later, when I use abbreviation of a CPA, that's what it means. In terms of the second type of a non-market strategy is equally important for international firms to consider nowadays. And then I will leave some time for your Q&As, and I already presented in terms of how I look back in my past research and my experience in publishing in academic journals yesterday. But if we have more time today, I will be happy to also share with you, and I welcome any of your questions during my presentation. Okay. So now this is my background. So as you can see, in my education background, I did my undergraduate in the National Taiwan University. And then afterward, I got my degree from University of Hawaii. And then I went ahead and studied the management PhD from University of Arkansas. So you can see how my journey is from the east to the west, right? So I have been teaching in the US for over 10 years. And this is usually how I introduce my background to my American students. Okay, so Taiwan is a small nation, right? So we only have a population of 23 million compared to your beautiful country. This is like a small country, right? And then I went studying in the US, and I work in the US now. And but if you look at the GDP as a comparison, controlling for purchasing power parity, you can see that Taiwan, being an emerging economy, really experienced huge growth in the recent years, right? So just in purchasing power parity, we have a total of 65,000 annually per capita, and which is very close to GDP per capita, just in purchasing power parity in the US, right? And Brazil, equally impressive. You have experienced the impressive economic growth in the recent years, and you can see in terms of GDP growth, you guys have a 2.9% in the last year, right? So being from an emerging economy myself, you can see how I'm interested in studying how those firms can be more successful when they compete with those global giants in the developed markets, right? So in the early stage of my academic journey, I was looking at those impressive international strategy of those emerging market multinationals, right? So well-known examples can be Tata. I believe all of you have heard about this company, right? So where is the home country of Tata? India, right? And how did they compete with those developed markets? Does anyone know?
Frugal innovation.
Thorough innovation, frugal innovation, very good. And what else? When they try to compete with, for example, other car companies like Toyota or the Audi, BMW, how did they compete? What was the international strategy? Well, they acquired the existing well-known brands, right? Jaguar Land Rover was acquired by Tata back in 2007. Okay, so through a series of acquisition, they were able to establish their global business landscape in the relatively short time frame, right? And Acer is another well-known example, right? Acer originated from Taiwan, and it's a successful computer company nowadays, right? So in my early stage of academic journey, I focused on those emerging market multinational companies acquisition. And I published several papers in terms of how they can overcome their liability formulas. And in the recent year, I switched my focus to CSR. And today, I'm going to share with you my current research on how those firms can use their non-market strategy to overcome the political risk that they face in developing markets. Now, geopolitical risk is a subset of a political risk. Okay, so this is a textbook definition of a political risk, right? So political risk refers to the changes in the political environment that is going to negatively affect the business activities, right? So now let's look at the definition of geopolitical risk. Okay, so geopolitical risk has the similar negative consequences for those international firms. But the type of risk that you refer to is about the likelihood of having wars, terrorist attacks, or the tension between the nation states, right? So here I give you two examples. One is starting in 2018, China and the US are placing trade restrictions against each other. Right? So these two countries trade war affect a lot of international business activities in many industries around the world, right? So other nations were forced to take side, right? So are you going to join the US camp or the China camp? Right? So it makes things really difficult for a lot of international firms. And that's the extent of the geopolitical risk we are looking at today. Okay, and even in developed markets, you can imagine for those Chinese firms, they have additional liability importance they need to overcome, right? And then, even more recently, we do see the likelihood of the war increase over time, right? So Ukraine and Russia is another good example about how international firms have to monitor those geopolitical risks when they are conducting their international business. So this is a classic framework I use in my research to study the challenges for the companies to think about how they can navigate the differences between their home market and the host market. So I'm sure you're probably familiar with this framework based on institutional theory, right? So there are two types of institutional rules. International firms have to be able to adapt the host country environment so they can be more successful, right? So I will use this classic example to show you how we can use this framework, right? So in Google's case, they entered the Chinese market in 2005. So what was the significant formal institutional difference between the US and China that Google had to overcome? What do you think? Maybe the laws are different, the business regulations are different, and the most salient differences in business regulation is going to be about the censorship policy, right? So for Google, they willingly comply with the censorship policy with the Chinese government, and that's how they can start operation in China. But over the years, you can see how Chinese governments are becoming more and more demanding in terms of the type of censorship that Chinese government wanted Google to help with, right? So we all know about the Google search engine, right? So when you go out to keep in the words and try to search for certain terms, and Chinese government is trying to make sure that certain words are no longer searchable on Google search engine, right? So in 2010, Google felt that enough is enough. They decided not to comply with the censorship policy anymore, and that's when they stopped the operations in China. Okay, so I use this example to show you that, okay, so during the entry decision, Google must have already analyzed the situation in terms of the censorship and requirement in the formal institutional rules, right? And it was willingly to comply with this requirement to be able to operate in China. But over time, more and more informal cultural differences in terms of how much business need to comply with governmental censorship policy becomes more and more challenging, right? So this example is to show us that, you know, it's not just like when you enter the market and you do your homework and then you have to, you know, realize that how difficult it is. But then over time, you have to constantly monitoring the environment. And when the policy change, you also have to take into account the state of political risk. So now we can look at the topic today in terms of emerging market multinationals. Okay, so like I just mentioned, Tampa primarily use merger and acquisition as an entry mode when they go to different foreign markets. Okay, so it acquired the Catholic in 2000, and then it acquired the Forest, which is a Dutch oil company in 2006, and then it acquired Geopolitical over in 2007. Right, so through this series of acquisition, you can see how now is very successful, very diversified, conglomerate, and it has a huge global empire around the world in the global business environment, right? So for these emerging market firms, the acquisition is great for them to establish those global business landscape because they can acquire both traditional strategic asset as well as a non-traditional strategic asset, right? So in China's example, they acquired the brain, they acquired the distribution channels, and they were able to compete with other developed marketplaces. So now, this is usually I used to analyze the liability of authorities, right? So for emerging markets, for they have additional hurdle because the institutional environmental differences are significant in the sense that you're going to see how in the informal institutional environment, the emerging market firms are not familiar with those recent regulation. And nowadays we talk about sustainability, right? So a lot of emerging market firms do not have to comply with those environmental protection standards, but on the safety standards. So they are not as familiar when they go to compete in developed markets. That's additional challenge. Now, in terms of the informal institutional rules, you can see how in a lot of emerging markets like here in Latin America, like in my home country, like in Asia, a lot of the companies that have a so-called family business group, right? So this concept is different from how companies are set up in developed markets, right? So that's additional challenge for them to overcome. So now, I use the construct of legitimacy a lot in my research because I think that these constructs really nicely capture the additional hurdle emerging market firms have to overcome. So let's look at the definition of legitimacy. So legitimacy means that it's a generalized perception or assumption that the actions of an entity are desirable, proper, or appropriate. Right? So who get to decide a company's business behavior is appropriate? It depends, right? So it depends on what? It depends on the host country's standard and the perception about what's considered legitimate, right? So in this case, so Wanda Cinema Group is a successful Chinese entertainment conglomerate. They acquired AMC theaters in the US in 2012, and he also acquired legendary entertainment production in 2016. Okay, so both were successful acquisition in here, but the process was very difficult for them because a lot of the US stakeholders do not consider these Chinese acquirers as legitimate players because they have a lot of concern about the national security, right? In the recent cases about TikTok, okay, so you probably heard about this. TikTok is going to be banned in the US if they don't change ownership within the next year. Okay, so that's the extent of the political risk Chinese firms have to deal with in the US market. Right? So in my research, I used the definition from Eden and Miller back in 2004 to look closer about the idea of liability for returns. Okay, so those gonna be three substantial hazards the companies have to deal with. The first one is about unfamiliarity hazard. So for example, Chinese firms do not have enough knowledge about how to deal with the diagonal pressure. Okay. So here the example I give for you is about the diversity, equity, and inclusive discussion in the US. Okay, I don't know if you guys follow the news, but there, it's very polarized, the political environment in the US. For some states, if they have more Democratic voters, they support the DEI, but in other states where Republican voters are majority, they dislike DEI. They ban DEI change for all the companies, right? So such a controversial issue is going to be additional challenge for emerging market firms to mitigate and try to decide on the corporate policy, right? And the second type of hazard is called a relational hazard. So that's based on how much experience the international firm has to monitor those business partners' behaviors, right? So once again, nowadays we talk about sustainability reporting a lot, and in EU, actually, it's mandatory for you to report your sustainability practices, right? So ENFCs also have to learn how to cultivate the trustable relationship with their business partner, because in a lot of emerging economies, we simply do not have that kind of sustainability requirements yet, right? And then the second type of hazard is called a discriminatory hazard. Okay, so basically the idea is that back to the idea of the legitimacy, right? So developed market stakeholders still have some preconceived notion and the stereotype about those emerging economies, right? So those kind of stereotypes, it could be about, for example, weak protection of workers' rights, lower product safety standard, or inferior product quality, right? So now let's think about if you are the business executive for, say, those Chinese firms, Indian firms, or Taiwanese firms that have to compete with those American firms in the US, what would you do to overcome those concerns? Okay. So I already gave you some answer in the beginning of my presentation, right? So basically today I'm going to talk about two types of strategy. One is in terms of a CSR, another one is a CPA, right? So in this case, if the emerging market firms can imitate and copy what those American firms are doing well in the US market, they are likely to overcome the first two types of hazards, right? Because of reality, they can learn, right? They can get understanding about the specific regulation. They will do better over time, right? Second type of hazard, relational hazard, they also can learn, right? So they can try to see how those American firms are maintaining their politics, okay? So you can see the citation I put down here. And so in this group of researchers, they look at the individual's perception about stereotypes, and they analyze those stereotypes to see why do people have to stereotype other people, right? So they break them into two dimensions. One is considered warmth against others, and the second one is considered competence against others, right? So based on those two dimensions, you have a 2 by 2, 4 different stereotypes according to your evaluation of somebody that is unfamiliar to you, and you start processing the information you have about those individuals, and through those social judgments, and it's likely for you to form those basic 4 types of stereotypes against the other person. Okay, so as you can see here, we have some examples of the 4 stereotypical groups, right? So, for example, paternalist stereotypes. In the US, the elderly groups belong to those kind of stereotypes. So basically, they consider them is not likely to compete for resources with them. That's why US consumers tend to have a more warm perception about elderly group. But at the same time, they don't consider them as competent, right? So that's why you can see that elderly people or disabled people are put into that category, right? So now, if we look at, say, there's some of the stereotypes related to low worth and low competence, and that's when you're going to be considered as a contextual stereotype. So that means, you know, even though we don't consider those people as a threat to us, so we will have, you know, in terms of how we don't really feel that they are competent of taking care of themselves. And they are also going to be a threat to the society, the burden to the society, and that's how they are put into the stereotypical group. Okay. And then the third stereotypical group is called the envious groups. Okay, and if you gotta consider the context of this study, right? So back in 2002, and this study is done in the U.S. context, and back then, Korean women are considered as very competent, but they are threat to other people who are competing for the job opportunities. Therefore, people have these envious stereotypical beliefs about them, right? And then the admiration groups means that usually those are the people who are considered as dominant reference groups, and the society appreciate this kind of, in terms of in-group members and close allies, right? So depending on the societal context you are in. So right now, in the US, you can see there are a variety of the different reference groups, and depending on which diverse category you are looking at. And as long as that people consider them as in terms of friendly groups and very capable of taking care of themselves, they will be put into admiration groups. So now, I'm going to use this group to talk about four level observations. Okay, so initially in social psychology, this is done at the individual level as far as how we can evaluate another individual. Right? Now let's look at four level. Okay, so once again, this is a study done in the US context, and you can see how different brands are put into different categories based on consumers' evaluation of the competence and wants associated with those brands. Okay, so you can see how, for example, Coca-Cola and Campbell's were evaluated the most favorable. Those two companies are doing great things for the society, so people have a warm perception associated with them. At the same time, those two brands are considered doing very well in their market, right? So they are fully capable of doing CSR in the US market, and therefore they are considered as a admiration stereotype. And then you can see on the other hand, okay, so back in 2013, right? So that's a little bit after financial crisis. So both BP and the Goldman Sachs are considered as low competence, right? They got themselves into trouble, right? So BP has an oil spill, and Goldman Sachs has some financial issue. So they're considered low competence. At the same time, they created a lot of negative impact on the society, right? So those two brands are put into the category of a contemptuous stereotypes because of those low evaluation of those dimensions. Okay. And now about the lowlights and the same things you can see. Well, those companies are doing very well, very capable of developing those really high-end products. But U.S. consumers have a low warmth toward the brands. They consider them as a threat, right? So if the NPS groups, it's not as well received as the admiration groups. Now, for the paternalistic brands, you can see both are important infrastructure for the U.S., right? So United States Postal Service and the Amtrak was the railway company. And now they are not capable because their delivery service is not as competitive as other private companies, but people do have a warm perception towards those brands. And so we can see how that stereotype content model can also be applied when we look at the firm level observations. So that's gonna lead me to my proposition for you. So now, if you think about CSR, okay, so we have already done a lot of research in the past decades about CSR, right? So, and I also have a couple of the papers published in this area. So I was looking at the emerging market firms organization. When the companies are doing more CSR, they can perform better after their acquisition. Okay, and now I also have an example for you, right? China Solar is a Chinese solar panel provider. And the company is great in terms of reporting their sustainability. The company won several awards And so it's considered as a very trusting partner around the world, right? So you can see how CSR can help the companies to really recognize the importance of the host country stakeholders, right? So we talk about how the EMS have to overcome liability authorities in the developed market, right? So by overcoming those negative stereotypes against them, right? So if the EMNCs can consider those multiple stakeholders' interests in the host market, they are more likely to improve the perception of the warmth and the competence, right? So here's a twist though, okay? If you look at the past decades of a CSR research, and here's the summary of the recommendation in terms of what the EMNC should be doing, all right? So principle number one, EMNC should not interfere with the internal political affairs of the host country, okay? And principle number two, EMNCs should preserve the safety and the health of the consumers. Principle number three, you can see how EMNC should respect the host country's laws and regulations. And the principle number four, MCs should also cooperate with the host government to improve the practices. Okay, so this summary is based on CSR research that is to look at the traditional developed market first in a time where we have a stable political environment worldwide. Right? So a special case can be made when you look at the recent conflicts, right? So, for example, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, McDonald's was really quick to make announcements. They're gonna exit the Russia market, right? So, in the announcement, McDonald's cited the two reasons. First, it didn't want to have anything to do with the government that caused the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Okay. And second, it cited the reason about unstable political environment that is going to negatively affect business in Russia. So it decided to exit the Russia market. Right? So now this announcement, this business decision is already against the principle number one, to not interfere with the host country's political affairs, right? So now, did McDonald's make the right decision to announce exiting Russia? Okay, we have a lot of different ways to analyze this business decision, right? So based on the framework I just presented, we can look at institutional environmental differences, and then we can also consider the stakeholders' perception about McDonald's business decision in Russia, right? So for Russian stakeholders, you can imagine once McDonald's decided to leave Russia altogether, their financial interests are definitely being disrupted, right? So all the employees gonna be losing jobs, suppliers are losing business contracts, right? So it definitely hurt some host government stakeholders, right? So why didn't McDonald's make that decision? Geopolitical reason, right? Because it felt it was doing the right thing for the global society, right? So now, by contrast, Subway is another American chain restaurant. It decided to stay in Russia. So the company made this decision to stay because they feel by staying in Russia, they can contribute better to take care of those host country stakeholders' interests. So now who's right? Which company is right? That's the business dilemma nowadays. A lot of companies have to consider.
The future tell us.
The future will tell us. Okay. All right. Okay. So my proposition here for you today is that we have to have a more holistic evaluation of the company's CSR and beyond just traditional playbook of what do we know about those CSR principles, right? So second market strategy is equally important nowadays, and which is about the corporate political activities. That means how do you evaluate the host country political stakeholders' expectation? And then you can make a sound decision after you consider both, right? And that's why the topic of my presentation today is corporate social political engagement, because you have to consider both the CSR as well as the CPA to make the right sound business decision, given today's political environment. So now you can think about CPA as a normal activity in a functioning democracy, right? So I'm using US as an example because that's what I'm familiar with. But in Brazil, you also have democratic government, right? So you can think about nowadays around the world, we have a so-called representative democracy, right? So for those voters to get their voice heard, lobbying is a functioning mechanism in the US. And a lot of the big tech firms are doing this. And this stats is from 2021. You can see how Facebook and Amazon spend about 20 billion that year in lobbying. And Microsoft and Google both spend about 10 million lobbying. Okay. So why do those companies spend those amounts? Well, that's really significant amount, right? So you have millions of dollars in lobbying activities, right? So for them, it's a critical time for them to make sure that the policymakers are considering all interests when they are making policy changes according to the development of artificial intelligence, right? So ChatGPT, OpenAI, and now we also have a Copilot, Gemini, right? So all of those important issues, the big tech firms are using the lobbying dollars as a way for them to educate those policymakers, right? So we want to have the free competition, and we also want to have a sound regulation that making sure that our IP is protected. But at the same time, we don't want to have overreach from the government in the way that the companies no longer innovating, right? So that's why they are spending those lobbying amounts. So this is a chart about how much spending in lobbying in the US from foreign entities. Okay, so not only American firms are doing lobbying, a lot of the foreign governments and companies are doing lobbying in the US as well. And this is the stats in 2023. You can see how in total, I believe there's about 4.22 billion in lobbying in 2023. And out of those, government of Liberia, which is an African country, right? So they lobby and for that amount. And then we also have Xingdao News Corp. That's Chinese state-owned news media is lobbying as well. And then CCTV America, and then so now, is the NMC doing lobbying in the US? The answer is yes. So they are also learning to use the CPA to balance political stakeholders' expectation in the developed market. So now the total spending since 2016 was over $5 billion. And then the country with the highest amount of spending is from China. Okay, so in the US, the lobbying is considered as a normal political activities, as well as the firms are reporting, and by regulation, they have to document how much they spend on lobbying. So that's why we have those numbers. So now EMS is also mimicking those American firms to use the CPA to gain legitimacy. And one of my recent paper is showing that, when those MNCs engage in lobbying, they tend to have better post-acquisition performance. However, CPA can help increase competence perception, but not warmth perception. And I'll give you an example. The TikTok, right? TikTok was spending in lobbying since 2019. And you can see in 2023, it spent over $8 million in lobbying. But in the end, it backfired because now TikTok was more or less visited by some political actors in the US. So now you can see, I also want to introduce another example about the TSMC. On the other hand, Taiwan semiconductor companies, is one of the leading chip making nowadays, right? So it's building the foundry in Arizona. And if you look at TSMC as a prime example, EMC operating in the US, you can see also need to deal with the perception of the confidence and the warmth, right? So for them, they have a huge challenge in terms of increasing geopolitical risk as well as the differences in human resource management practice. So for them, they are doing CSR really well, and this snapshot is taken directly from their CSR report. They are surveying the stakeholders' issues every year and try to identify what are the most pressing concerns from those stakeholders. And so for them, the important CSR strategy they should focus on in the US is about their relationship with the US government, right? So now they just got the funding approved by the Congress. They are getting $6 billion into fund the setup of the manufacturing firm. And now, in terms of the host employees, they also change their compensation and benefit, so they will be more consistent with the US standards. And another things they have to change a lot is about the working schedule, because a lot of the people who work for TSMC in Taiwan, they don't normally have a 9-to-5 schedule, because a lot of engineers are on call at the night. There is no such thing as finish work and go home. It's not like that. But in the US, they have to adapt, right? So they have to also consider the practice in the US and then change their employment practice accordingly. And then the last one is about the host community engagement. So for them, they are able to hire the local employees and also help them foster the supplier chain, in terms of the network. So they will be able to supply those parts for the record. So now for CPA, okay. So what the TSMC was doing is ever since 2020, they started investing in lobbying activities in the US. And you can see that over the years, 2020, 2021, 2022, 2023, they spend more and more each year. In 2023, they spend a total of $3 million in lobbying. But the amount is still a lot less than most big tech firms in the US, I can show you, right? And for them, the way they spend their lobbying is interesting. Okay, so here is a list of the different fields they lobby in the US. And the first one is US Taiwan Expedited Double Tax Relief Act. And the second one is American Innovation and Jobs Act. So you can see how they use the CPA trying to benefit the host country and the home country stakeholders, right? So it's not specific to their own company's interest, but they're trying to benefit the stakeholders as well. Okay. So here's the conclusion of my presentation for you today. Okay, so the first one is geopolitical risk assessment is a necessity nowadays when you are doing international business. And those two are important database available online. So I will encourage you to look into it if you are interested in this topic. And one is called the political affinity. And that's based on countries' voting pattern and the United Nations, right? So they're putting many different issues in terms of international affairs, right? So regulatory debt or how the healthcare need to be improved in some part of the region. So when the countries are voting on those issues, if the countries' votes are more aligned, that means they have a higher political affinity. That means it will be easier for the company from those firms to do business together, right? And by contrast, if the political affinity is low, that means it will have a higher political risk for you to do business in that country, right? So US, China, once again, are a great example, right? So they don't see eye to eye in a lot of international affairs, and you're gonna have a higher political risk for US firms to do business in China and the vice versa, right? And now the second important data for us to assess the geopolitical risk is called the nationalism sentiment. And this is also publicly available database online now. You can check to see how high or how low the nationalism sentiment is in a given country at a given point of time. So those are also important indicators of political risk. So in terms of a CSR, we already talked about how if the company is taking into account multiple stakeholders' interests, it's more likely for them to use CSR to improve both confidence and one's perception, right? But if the company only focuses on CPA, that's when it will be more likely becoming the case of the TikTok, right? So the company can show their competence in lobbying, but not necessarily improve the perception of the workers. And that's why when companies doing CPA, they should consider once again the host country and the home country stakeholders' interests and lobbying for the greater societal good and not just focus on the specific firm's interests, right? And if you want to know more about what TikTok is about, and you can simply Google search TikTok's lobbying and ads. You will see a lot of negative to report about what they did wrong. And basically try to get their users to call the congressperson and say that you should stop the thing. But that's only gonna benefit TikTok, right? So it's doing exactly the opposite of what lobbying is supposed to be for, right? So you should influence policy changes in the good direction that benefit the society, not just only to benefit the company. Okay, so that's the conclusion of my presentation today. Any questions, comments?
Any question? I have one question. I've been talking about the strategies that companies from emerging markets or from the developing markets use in the development economies such as the United States through lobbying and through this political activity. I was wondering what was the main strategy of Liou in China?
Okay, so Google initially was saying, okay, I will help you screen some keywords. So Google actually got the list of words from Chinese government in 2005. So they did that, they cooperated with Chinese government, right? But over time, the list of keywords is getting longer and longer. And so Google just felt like, well, I can't censor so much, different information because the mission of the Google is to provide free information for all, right? So in a way, the compliance with the Chinese government is already against how the company is based on, right? So they just decided not to do it.
And did they develop any political activity?
Okay, so that's a very good question. Okay, so what I present to you today about CPA, right? The main reason is lobbying, right? And lobbying works in democracy, right? Around the world, we have many different political systems. So China is the exception, right? So lobbying is not going to be an effective mechanism of the CPA in China. Is that the connection with the government officials will be more effective.
It's another kind of activity, right?
Exactly.
Not really lobbying, because this is also the case for Brazil. Brazil lobbying is prohibited.
Okay.
So companies are not allowed to do it. It is looked at as a pejorative, a bad action from companies to lobby with the government.
Right.
So we, Tinora and I, have developed a case study with a student, a PhD student, on the strategies of developed companies from developed markets in emerging markets. Because if we take a look at this, I keep wondering, okay, if we look to the opposite, where the company sometimes has more strict rules, for example, to protect the environment than the country itself, or they have they proportionate better conditions for the workers than it is required in the host country. What about those companies in developing countries, in emerging countries, right? It is an interesting perspective to see what kind of approval or legitimacy do they need if they have such good practices already, right? So it's interesting to see what kind of legitimacy they develop here and what kind of political activity is linked to the search for legitimacy, which is not lobbying.
Exactly.
It's sometimes about being embedded in the community to have the support, to have the authorization of the government or something, but it's different from what emerging multinationals do in developed markets. So it's
Exactly.
your presentation reminds me a lot of those cases we have seen here that is challenging for
Developed market.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. You're absolutely right. So that's why we should work together. Right? And somewhere I should come again, right?
That's true.
Right? Yeah.
Lucy, thank you for your presentation. Really good. I have a question. How, in favor, to describe the geopolitical risks, for example, pandemic, COVID, and all the war, wars. How can we describe that? Because we are not in that context, for example, Israel or Russia, and how describe it as a geopolitical risk.
Okay, so that's a very important question, right? Professor is always asking good questions, right? So that's why we have to go back to the literature, right? So when we look at the literature, the construct definition is really about the change of the environment that is going to negatively affect the business, right? So that's why the first thing I presented to you when I get into the topic was about the extent of the political risk that is going to negatively affect the business dealings, right? So in this case, we're not looking at the economic, in terms of how the monetary policy change, for example. That's not a political risk, okay? That would be considered as economic risk, okay? And how about financial crisis? Is it a type of a political risk? Well, yes and no. If it affects the policy change in the direction negatively impact the international business, then yes, we will consider that as a political risk. But as you can see, the trigger of a financial crisis is not necessarily political, right? It's more likely it's just the financial system itself. It's already got to the point, right? So in 2008 and 2009, in the case, it was the subprime, the mortgage. It's really risky, and a lot of banks just didn't do a good job to evaluate those loan holders' credit before they give out the loans, right? So that type of risk will not be considered as a political risk, right? And after the financial crisis, though, U.S. government placed more stringent requirements about how you need to document your financial transactions. So the change of the regulation itself is going to be considered as a political risk. Okay, and when we look at geopolitical risk, that has something to do with the country's relationship. Okay, in other words, when we look at geopolitical risk, we use a very specific type of a political risk to assess the likelihood that negatively impact the business, right? So we are looking at the China-US relationship. We are looking at how Ukraine was under the attack from Russia, and now we have Israel Hamas, right? So if it involves the nation states, right? So you have two different countries involved in this conflict tension. It doesn't have to be the war, right? So that's the more tangible type of geopolitical tension, but as long as there is a better relationship between two countries, we will consider it as a geopolitical risk. Did I answer your question? Okay, precisely. All right. Any other questions, comments?
Yeah, just for a comment about what's other also using the US as an example for your study. And I was thinking about when you said about CSR and political corporate actions in general, and how they both together can help the company to have legitimacy in another country. But I think that Europe is not the context, it's more like related to the US. But now we can see like political groups trying to capture the CSR movement to other one, and the other fact, and the other side, the other one says that CSR is not really interesting. Another says, so how can we work with political and CSR in this kind of context? I was just more wondering about that because you have like the Republicans making a lot of politics against the CSR movements, and despite the Democrats are going the opposite way. So how to balance it to make the correct involvement related with those cases?
Exactly, right. So very interesting observation, right? So that's why I was using those three type of answers to talk about the liability of authorities, right? So one of the example is going to be how nowadays you look at different labels of the CSR, you might get into very controversial discussion, right? So DEI was big one, and ESG is another one. And CSR initially started out as corporate social responsibility, right? It emphasized more on social performance of the company, right? So what does the company have as a responsibility to benefit the society, right? So if you go back to Milton Friedman, no such thing. I want to be clear. So, if you ask my husband, who's a finance professor, he will still tell you the only responsibility for a firm is to make a profit. If the company doesn't make a profit, the company no longer exists. Okay. So now, why is that really problematic? We already know, right? So if the company is only focusing on maximizing the financial probability of the firm, it created a lot of negative externality that the society has to observe, right? So that's when we start talking about CSR, okay? So corporations, you have a responsibility to the society to make sure that, yes, your business is doing well. And do you still want to do well in the next 5 years, 10 years to come? If you want to, you better make sure the society is still there for you to operate, right? So that's why CSR is another important movement back then. So now we go into another era where CSR become politicized, right? So a lot of the politicians were attacking those companies' CSR. For example, a lot of the more conservative Republicans in the US was saying that, okay, company, when you are doing CSR, are you actually doing good to society? right? So we look at the greenwashing, we look at the brown washing, we look at all kinds of the CSR marketing scam. And for them, that's the major problem. That's why CSR has such a negative connotation nowadays when we use it, right? So what's next? Well, it could be sustainability, right? So it could be sustainable development goals, right? But the bottom line is those are different labels, right? So to me, I think the important part is to look at your company's mission and your vision, right? So how do you consider your relationship with different stakeholders should be the same, the core part of your non-market strategy, right? So that's why we use non-market strategy to describe it. If you only use market strategy, your focus is going to be on customer, your suppliers, and that's about it, right? But if you look at the non-market strategy, you will consider many other important stakeholders that are impacted by your business decision, right? Or they can impact your business decision. So that's why I think a stakeholder analysis is going to be a better instrument for company to do well, while at the same time do good to the society. Yeah, does that help? Okay, right. Any other question? And if you want me to talk about the second part, I can. So
Are okay with it? Yeah, okay. Why we didn't, but first of all, thank you so much for bringing this amazing lecture about such an interesting subject. In a context of an even more politicized business environment in international business, right?
Yeah.
So your lecture is very well aligned with what our issues, our concerns, and our interests here. And it was a very good structured way of dealing with this subject. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so Professor wanted to talk about the part I presented with a smaller group of the students yesterday. So
Very good. If you want to just make it short, I should make it short and just do.
Because you must be tired, right? You're having to speak too loud, so you must be tired.
Oh, I'm okay. Okay, so I shared this with the group yesterday because I think some of you might feel that, sometimes when you try to write a paper to submit to a journal, and the journal doesn't give you like a really good feedback, and sometimes you don't know why you got rejected. Right? So I have 10 years of experience of publishing, and that's why I want to use my experience just to share my reflection. So hopefully that can help you. And this is my Google Scholar profile. You can see those are the foremost slides in the paper. So I'm going to use the lesson I learned through publishing those 4 papers, and hopefully that can help you. So the first paper was about my dissertation, actually. I finished my dissertation in 2013, and this paper was published in Journal of World Business in 2017. And this is the model I have in the paper. So you can see I hypothesized 2 main effects of the informal and the formal institutional distance. And then I have 2 moderating effects. Okay, so it's about emerging market versus a whole country market size, as well as the regulatory institutional quality, right? And so in this research, I was using a database called the SDC Go that has the worldwide merger and acquisition data. And my school also didn't have the data And I was lucky to get the data from my co-authors, right? So I guess the lesson learned here is it's a good idea to go to a conference, to network, and I think a professor, Nora, and make sure that you guys have all the opportunity to interact with researchers from all other universities. So it's the time for you to consider how you can reach out and build up a database like this. So in this paper, I merged the data set from World Bank, which is publicly available, and a lot of the good data about international issues, and you definitely want to take a look there. And then Index of Economic Freedom was developed by Heritage Foundation, and another more up-to-date type of data you can look at is called economic and political economic policy uncertainty. Okay, so that is also existing database that you can use. And the last one is Global Competitiveness Report that's developed by World Economic Forum as well. And you have to write to them and explaining why you need this data for your research, and they will give it to you, right? So don't afraid of asking them. I guess that's the thing I'm trying to say. And then the second thing I learned in this publication experience is to try to write for academic journals audience, right? So you have to understand the literature first, right? So you want to make sure that the words you are using don't have to be really fancy vocabulary or sentence, a complex sentence structure. But actually, if I review a paper and that paper is written in a way that makes me feel that it's not written by researcher, I will have that tendency to reject the paper. Okay, so you want to use consistent wording. That is how the construct is used in the literature to talk about your finding. And that is very critical because remember, when you publish for a journal and your reviewers are those people who are publishing in that journal as well, right? So you have to speak the language that your audience understand, right? So that's why it's very important for you to read the paper from the journal you try to submit it, and try to use the same words those people are using. Okay. And then another thing I like to share is I don't like rejection nowadays. Right? The rejection to me feels like an invitation to revise for another journal. Okay. So average it took me about 3 years to publish a paper. That's how long it's gonna take. Because some of my papers are going around different journals. It could be 5 or 6 journals before you actually accept it. Okay, so in this journey, we just have to be patient. Okay. Now this is a paper published in 2017, International Business Review. And you can see I have a specific context in this paper, which is about South African firms' foreign acquisitions. So I have a main hypothesis about the colonial time, where you have a lot of trade colonizers in Brazil as well. So you could consider using the colonial tie as a specific context to talk about your finding. Okay, and it will be interesting as long as you can generalize your finding to a greater context of emerging economies, right? So sometimes I was, usually asked the question, right? If I only have a single country study, will that be acceptable to submit to an international business journal? Okay, so the answer to that question is it depends, right? It depends on how you can talk about the result in the sense that other emerging economies, will also have a similar condition that they can learn from your findings, right? So as long as you can make that kind of a generalized findings, and you will, it will be good for the journal. Now, the third paper is about political affinity, and it was published in Journal of American Studies in 2020. So in this paper, we use a lot of regression technique to control for the cross-label issue. I think that's another important part of doing international business research, right? So you have those country-level effects, but usually your outcome variable of interest is the per-level observation, right? So you have a cross-label issues. You have to carefully control for the effect using different kinds of techniques. So here is what we did for the this paper. Now, I also had a chance to do the workshop for this spatial issue, and the editors were very helpful. We did our presentation, and we were giving feedback right there. So that was great to help you to revise the paper. And even if you don't have a chance to do that kind of face-to-face workshop, and don't be shy. So sometimes when the editor sends you something, it's okay to follow up and ask them for more clarifications, right? So when you are getting an invitation to revise for a journal, that means your paper is very promising, and you can go ahead and respond to editor's email if there's any things you are not sure about. And the most recent paper was in Journal of International Business Policy. And this is a identity typology I developed based on parent-subsidiary relationship. You can see how I hypothesized 4 different types of identification relations between parent-subsidiary, and I use this typology to talk about how sometimes it is a really long journey because the typology was developed in my second year of PhD. And I never published anything with this typology until recent years when I was using the typology to talk about the SDG implementation. And this is a conceptual paper where I talk about how different identity relationships between parent and subsidiary firms will have a different implication on how the foreign subsidiary can improve their SDG. And this is what we did in the paper. So once again, I think it is great that all of you are interested in doing research in the international business area. In particular, I think we have a unique privileged position to really observe the empirical and trying to make sense of it and to help inform better policy making. So that's why I think we can all, it is a painful process, but at the same time, it's doable as long as you can be consistent with this journey, right? So this is what I do usually. So I look at the business news right from Bloomberg, Wall Street Journal, and the US. Like in Brazil, you also have a different news outlets, and it's always great idea to pick up the news. And then you can subscribe to the academic community research, like for AIB, Academic International Business. There are several different chapters, right? So here you have a Latin American and Caribbean chapter. That should be, the way for you to get a update on in terms of your academic community discussion as well. And a lot of the journals have the spatial issues, right? So when they have a spatial issues, that means they are particularly interested in certain phenomena, in certain theoretical framework, right? So for me, I keep a file of spatial issues. Even if I don't need to submit some people those spatial issues, but I keep those just so I understand what's the most current discussion in the academic community. And then, the last thing I think is just be consistent with what you're doing to write for those academic journals. I use the folder. The only history that counts is the one over yourself, right? It's from the basis code, right? So it's a hard. It's you're gonna take a long time, but in the end, you can be really responsible in doing the research, and you can make great contribution. Okay, so yeah. All right. Question, thoughts, comments? I think I did. Wow.
Então, conseguiram seguir a lógica da apresentação? Ela falou sobre adequação da linguagem, não é só a tradução, mas sim a adequação da linguagem do artigo para o tipo de público daquela revista que nós estamos mirando, né? E também o fato de um artigo ser rejeitado não quer dizer que o artigo não sirva para nada, e às vezes só não está adequado àquela revista, né? Então a gente tem que ter uma escolha muito criteriosa da revista para qual nós queremos mandar o artigo. E uma das maneiras de resolver isso é olhar para a nossa bibliografia, para nossas referências, e ver quem é que nós estamos citando mais. Se nós decidimos que é uma outra revista, nós devemos sempre buscar alinhar o nosso artigo àquela revista, a linguagem, ao tipo de artigo que tem lá, e também usar os artigos daquela revista que é o nosso foco. Tá? Vocês têm alguma pergunta em português que eu possa traduzir para ela? Estão envergonhados ou... Não? Ok. That's it. Okay, good. They are shy. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I have my email here. If you guys want to email me,
Outra coisa importante que ela mencionou é ter o desenvolvimento da pergunta de pesquisa muito bem embasada na teoria. Para que quando se faça a análise, quando se colete os dados, isso não seja um problema, né? Às vezes a gente não constrói direito a base teórica que dá suporte à pergunta de pesquisa e ao desenvolvimento da pesquisa, e aí, quando coleta os dados, não consegue chegar aos resultados que estava esperando, às vezes tem que dar por função disso, tá? Thank you, Shiun. I hope you come here more often.
okay.
And that we can find some ways of working together with so many interesting issues that have presented here tonight. Basically, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Let's take a picture. Let's take a Não, gente, calma. Obrigada. Acho que eu tinha com esse gente procurando aqui. Ô, André, estou tentando parar a gravação aqui, mas está tudo trancado. Ó. Tá, eu vou tentar parar com você. I'll be right there.
Ok.
Se sair, simplesmente ele mantém a gravação, né?
Toda a calma do mundo começa a aparecer.
Ah, então ele está só lento.
Não deve estar aguentando a transmissão.
Não estou aguentando a ascensão.
You'll be right there then. Eu parei a transmissão e vou parar a gravação agora. Não é, eu consigo parar a transmissão, agora vamos parar a gravação agora. Isso aqui, exato. Mas assim, quando exatamente? Era bem na última mês, assim. Eu vi que semana que vem vai ter